Hello and welcome to everybody trickling in. We are just going to wait a moment as our numbers climb up. That's always exciting. So glad to have you with us here this evening. All right. So welcome to this evening's program, The Props Assist the House, Restoring the Homestead. My name is Elizabeth Bradley and I'm the Education Programs Manager at the Emily Dickinson Museum. We at the museum are pleased to be joining you virtually in your homes to share the exciting work that is being done to restore the poet's homestead. This restoration is the most significant that the museum has yet undertaken. So we want to invite you behind the scenes and even beneath some floorboards to learn more about the research we've uncovered and the decisions that go into restoration work. This program is part one of a three-part series that will continue in August and September, so we hope you will rejoin us for deeper dives into the architectural and decorative finishes. So before we begin, I have a few notes for our participants. We will be utilizing Zoom's auto transcription feature, so you may have noticed closed captioning at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you do not want to see these captions, simply select the Hide subtitle from your toolbar. Our program will last an hour. We're going to begin with a presentation by Executive Director Jane Wald, followed with an interview portion of Jane, and then conclude with time for audience questions. So we hope that you will share your questions during the program using the Q&A function of this webinar, which is located in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce my colleagues who have made this evening possible. The Emily Dickinson Museum is a part of Amherst College, and this evening was planned by Amherst College Summer Museum interns, Meenakshi Jani, Catherine McMay, and Melanie Schwimmer. Catherine produced a presentation that you will enjoy momentarily, and Meenakshi and Melanie will be interviewing Jane in the second half of this program. So, hello everyone, having everyone join me here in our view. So to introduce them, Meenakshi is a rising junior at Amherst College where she is majoring in environmental studies and history. As a development communications intern at the Emily Dickinson Museum, she has enjoyed engaging with a variety of audiences and local partners to help make Dickinson's story accessible and meaningful to the community. Katie McMay is part of the class of 2023 at Amherst College. She is the person who is responsible for the slideshow you are about to see, so we're crediting her here. She is majoring in English and psychology and was able to gain an even deeper appreciation for Emily Dickinson, her work, and her story as a collections intern this summer. She hopes that the work she has done with the museum allows wider audiences to get one step closer to the poet that she and so many others adore. Melanie Schwimmer is a member of the Amherst College class of 2023, majoring in American Studies. This summer, she has served as the programs intern for the Emily Dickinson Museum, which has allowed her to combine her passion for historical exploration with purposeful community engagement from the home of the poet who sparked her love of language. And finally, I am pleased to introduce Jane Wald, the Executive Director of the Emily Dickinson Museum. In her nearly 20 years at the museum, Jane has led many critical restoration and infrastructure projects that ensure these historic houses remain standing for another century and beyond, all while maintaining a vision for the museum that has ushered in an era of growth and creativity. So I will let you take it away now, Jane.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and thanks to Melanie, Meenakshi, and Katie for all the wonderful work that you've been doing this summer at the Emily Dickinson Museum. I just have so much to share, in a sense, about what the Emily Dickinson Museum is up to right now. Tonight, and for two subsequent installments, we're going to focus on restoration, but at the same time as the Emily Dickinson Museum is undertaking this major restoration project, we also are engaged in a 3-year project to document all of the 8,000 to 10,000 collections objects in the museum's collection. So there's a very great deal happening with the historic assets, the sort of the physical material culture of the Dickinson family's life and home. And I'm just very pleased to be able to speak with you about some of that this evening. So I'm going to share my screen to bring up a slideshow to illustrate some of what we're going to be looking at. And I think I have achieved screen sharing. Nope. There we go. Okay. Well, really, first, I'd like to just start with just a rush, in a sense, through the last 200 years of the homestead and how it's changed over time. So you can get a sense of the context for restoration. A building as old as the homestead with its different owners has gone through some changes to suit the needs of each family that has lived there. The house was first built in 1813 by Emily Dickinson's grandfather, Samuel Fowler Dickinson. It was at that time built, as you can see on the left side of the screen here. It was built as a fairly substantial and handsome federal style house. It was said to be one of the first brick houses in Amherst that at that time in the early 19th century mostly had wooden structures, classic sort of wooden New England townhomes and farmhouses. But it wasn't long before the homestead started to change and evolve. Even during Samuel Fowler Dickinson's ownership of the house between 1813 and 1833, there were some changes, such as having an office addition here to the left of the main house, and a few other adjustments. By the 1840s, the house was owned by a different family, David Mack, who was a prosperous merchant in Amherst. And at least by the time he was the owner of this house, you can see that the federal style hip roof had been raised quite significantly into a Greek Revival style gable roof, and the one-story office addition on the west side of the building had been raised into a two-story wooden addition. Also, a brick addition on the east side of the house to the right in your picture, that also had been added. So the house grew quite substantially during that time. And also changed its style from federal to Greek Revival. And let me see here. So by 1855, Edward Dickinson had found the resources to purchase the home, his family home, his sort of ancestral home, purchase it back from the Macks. And at this time in 1855, the Italianate villa style of architecture had taken hold on the Massachusetts, even in rural areas in Massachusetts. And during this same period, 1856, Edward was at the same time building a house for his son on the lot next door, which is a fully fully realized expression of Italianate architecture. At the same, while these Italianate ideas were floating about, Edward Dickinson took advantage of them to add a cupola that sort of spoke to Italianate design elements, changed the front entrance, added a veranda here on the west side that had its Italianate characteristics, and French doors on the side of the house as another nod to that style. Importantly, he built a small conservatory, a very modest structure, just maybe 6 feet by 18 feet, for his daughters. And that became an important element of their own life. So the line drawing you see on the left is more artistically rendered in the image on the right, which is a detail of a lithograph map of Amherst that was probably being drawn around 1856, but not published until 1858. And in this image, you can, I think, get a little bit more of the personality of the house. By the early 1900s, the house was sold out of the Dickinson family around 1916. And there were, again, some changes to the house at that time. The family that bought the house, the Park family, owned the house for the next 50 years. But one of the first things they did was to take off the kind of the failing conservatory, dismantle the large barn behind the house, but also they took off the failing paint color. During the 19th century, especially during the second half of the 19th century, as Emily Dickinson was living her adult life there, for most of that period, the house was painted in this ochre color, a kind of yellowish tan. And that color has been restored through at least a couple of rounds of restoration painting, the first in 2005 and the second just a couple of years ago. But for much of the for all of the, from 1916 to 2005, the house was, it appeared in a kind of neo-colonial color scheme with the red brick, the paint having been taken off the red brick, and with white trim. And it stayed that way until a restoration several years ago. You can see the difference between its, most of its 20th century personality here in a photograph in March 2004 before a restoration project, two projects that I'll explain in just a moment, and how it appears now after its restoration to its 19th century colorways during the period of greatest significance in Emily Dickinson's life. So the thing that you, when you saw the homestead in its brick and white trim expression there, you also saw large hemlock trees in front of the house. These, and you can see them now at quite a height. This image is from 2009, when the museum undertook a restoration of that hedge, which was always intended to be, a modest hedge of about 7, 8, 9 feet. But over the years, in the course of the 20th century, the hedge turned into a curtain of trees. So that restoring the original design intent there, it made a pretty great improvement to the appearance of the homestead. So one of the things, so having done that very, very quick tour of what the appearance of the exterior of the homestead over those couple of centuries, it's helpful to think about, you know, what is restoration, what is its purpose, and what does the Emily Dickinson Museum hope to achieve? In historic preservation parlance, there are kind of three principal treatments that can be applied to a historic structure. Before I talk about these, though, I'd like to mention another little bit of history of historic preservation, which is that the federal government became involved in preserving the nation's past, especially its historic sites, first by establishing a historic site program in the 1930s, and then by passing the National Preservation Act in 1966. The latter Preservation Act was really kind of an attempt to control what seemed to be kind of spiraling federal development projects that were moving historic sites out of the way and destroying some of those architectural examples and some of the sites that had meaning, cultural meaning to people. So that's kind of what the Historic Preservation Act was all about. But in tandem with that, these three kind of treatments describe what architectural historians and site managers are facing when issues of preservation arise. So first, preservation is more of a tool, a method to arrest the deterioration of a building and to repair it and maintain it with the kind of fabric and materials and form that it took originally and how it evolved over time. So it's kind of an attempt to conserve what is there without alteration. Restoration, on the other hand, is aimed at depicting a particular period of time that has been associated with a significant event or a significant person, which means reversing some of the changes that have happened since that particular target date. Then reconstruction or reproduction, it actually returns elements to a landscape or to a building that have not survived over time. So that is largely done to fill a gap that aids the organization in its interpretation of a site or of a story that it wants to tell. So for the homestead, for the buildings and the landscape at the Emily Dickinson Museum, the periods of significance that have been selected for these structures have a certain rationale behind them. So for the homestead, we know that Emily Dickinson was born in the homestead in 1830. She lived there for 10 years, was absent for about 15 years, and then returned with her family and lived until her death in 1886. And those were the period 1855 kind of marked what we know of her connection with the house and her most productive years as a poet. There aren't that many poems that we know of that predate 1855. So most of her work was done in that house during her adult years. So there's another little piece to this period of significance and why we haven't put its end date as Emily's death date in 1886. And that is that her sister Lavinia continued to live in the house and championed the publication of her sister's poetry until her death in 1899. So we consider Lavinia's work on Emily Dickinson's poetry to be part of a holistic story, to be part of what makes the homestead significant in both the creation of the poetry and also its presentation to the wider world. So that's the reason we've defined that period of significance as 1855 to 1899. The Evergreens, on the other hand, it is critically significant to Emily Dickinson's life and times, and also to the presentation of her poetry to the wider world. But in this instance, this is a case where the Evergreens is such an unusual state of stasis. From it hasn't changed very much from the end of the 19th century. So its decor, most of what you see inside that house actually dates from roughly 1880. And this period of significance moves through 1913, which is the year in which her sister-in-law, Susan Dickinson, died. So that's another bit of rationale for the different but overlapping periods of significance for those two houses. They are kind of united through Emily Dickinson's association with both houses. The landscape, on the other hand, the homestead landscape had its own personality, and the Evergreens landscape had a quite different personality as a kind of picturesque, cultivated green garden. So in order to be able to present stories both about Emily Dickinson and her love of nature and her own connection with the grounds and gardening, we wanted to represent her full adult life on that landscape. At the same time, we wanted to be able to talk about the contrasting design values and family activities on the Evergreens landscape, which had a different personality. So in that case, we've created this longer period of significance for the landscape. So for this particular project, Elizabeth said that this is the largest project we've ever done, and that's quite right. We've approached restoration very carefully through a lot of planning and research. And some of our first projects were restoration of Emily Dickinson's own room in 2015, 2016. Then close upon that, the restoration of the Homestead Library, plus the reconstruction of the conservatory. So this slide here, let me go back and just explain what else we're doing here. So we're working mostly within the original block of the house that you saw on the very first slide, the 1813 footprint. So that involves the two parlors on the first floor, front to back parlors, the wide main hallways on the first and second floors. There is a room, a bedchamber at the top of the stairs on the second floor. There will be, we'll relocate the staircase to the third floor because that staircase did not exist during Emily Dickinson's lifetime. So we'll relocate it to its original placement between Dickinson's room and the room behind hers. An important part of this whole project is the installation of a new comprehensive heating, ventilation, and cooling system. And that is an important change for the homestead, which now has a cooling system that serves only 4 spaces in the entire very large house. And that is intended to create an appropriate environment to keep and display sensitive collections objects. So here, these are the areas that I mentioned just a moment ago, the front and back parlors. This is the first floor, the wide hall on the first floor. a transverse hall, a smaller hallway that goes into this separate wing. And then on the second floor, we'll be restoring this bedroom, this and this wide main hall here. These areas, this green area is the library, which has already been restored. The conservatory has already been rebuilt. And up on the second floor, Emily Dickinson's room has already been restored. So you can see that this restoration is really going to take care of most of the main 1813 block of the house. So just quickly to show you the change that can come about through extensive research that is both documentary and actual forensic in a sense. Before the Homestead Library was restored, we had kind of guessed at colors and treatments, and you can see that the room is quite spare here. But after the restoration, it's taken on a much much richer kind of appearance with more depth of color, with some of these selections made on the basis of our research. So, similarly, in Emily Dickinson's bedroom before its 2015 restoration, this room was very neutral in its appearance because it had been the house had been a residence for so many years. But through research and some fortunate findings, we were able to both reproduce wallpaper and window treatments, but also use documentary evidence to guide the placement of furnishings in that space. The Homestead Parlor appears this way today, and it too will become quite a different space. And that's a story for one of the other programs in this series. But I can tell you that it's going to be quite a different appearance. So just one more little thing about this project, and that is the timeline. So in a way, we've been working on a short timeline. In another way, it's a long timeline. Some of our planning began way back in 1998 with the first comprehensive research done on the homestead, on its documentary history, on public records, on paint analysis, and some digging behind floorboards, digging behind baseboards to learn more about changes to the house over time. Things began to kind of heat up in 2015 with, as you saw just a moment ago, with the restoration of Emily Dickinson's room, with restoration of the library, reconstruction of the conservatory just a couple of years later. And then for this current project, it began in earnest in 2019 with a grant received to do research on this portion of the house to confirm earlier findings, to make new findings, and to come up with design plans for what that restoration would look like, both architectural plans and decorative plans. So that is now all in hand with a couple of very fine reports, and we're ready to begin. So with that, I think this is a time to talk with Melanie and Meenakshi.
Thank you so much for that great presentation and sharing that inside look into the restoration. It's thrilling to see so many people on this call from all around the world, as excited by Dickinson as our intern cohort has been this past summer. And so as historians, Meenakshi and I want to start by pulling back the curtains on the fact-finding missions that you mentioned behind the restoration. So we're curious, how do you know what the house actually looked like during the Dickinsons' her years of most productivity during those writing years, and what kind of research has been conducted to come to these conclusions?
Yeah, that's such a great question and such a difficult one, because maddeningly, there are no interior images of the Dickinson homestead during the 19th century. No photographs, no drawings, nothing like that. So where this begins for us is, I mentioned that in 1998, this sort of comprehensive research program into all different kinds of records, research into primary documents such as deeds, tax records, newspaper notices, family correspondence that might mention some change to the house, or how wonderful the house was looking at a particular time, and correspondence and documentation of people who were not family members, who may have reported on an event there, or on a reminiscence. Or there is one letter I recall where a visitor to the house in the 1840s wrote a letter in which he described a very complicated circulation pattern between, I think it was between the dining room and the kitchen. And, today you go into the house and you see there are these 5 doors. It was just very complicated. So, things like that help to confirm or suggest changes that have happened. There are historic photographs of the exteriors, which are extremely helpful. It's been a nice periodic record through the years. There are maps of Amherst that also help with sort of the development of properties, the chopping up of properties, or the acquisition of new little pieces, as to show how the grounds developed. There are a couple of really neat bird's eye maps where it's sort of a 3/4 view coming in from the side, and that gives some details about the homestead barn and some other things of that sort. And then architectural plans, if they exist. And the floor plan that I showed you all toward the beginning, that was actually a floor plan drawn in 1916 in connection with the sale of the homestead to the Park family. And one of the really helpful things about that is that it showed the state of the homestead at the end of the Dickinson's ownership. And being able to compare that floor plan with the current one, it shows us that, there were some changes that the Park family made, but not that many. So it's nice to be able to recognize in the house as it is, the house of the 19th century. So those are some of the things that we look for.
And
Thank you. Oh, sorry. You can go, Melanie.
Sorry, you mentioned that it's maddening how the Dickinsons didn't walk around with their cameras and just take pictures of every single object in the house, and this wall looks like this, and that Emily wasn't writing letters. Today I ate dinner in the room that looked exactly like this. And so we were curious, when that concrete evidence doesn't exist, how does the museum fill in those gaps?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that is a challenge for us at the homestead. I mentioned that the homestead and the Evergreens really are they've had very different histories, especially in the 20th century, because the Evergreens stayed really with the Dickinson family and their heirs. The homestead went to another family. Then it was purchased by Amherst College, which used it partly for faculty housing. So there needed to be residential changes there. So things are pretty settled at the Evergreens, not so much at the homestead. So when the concrete evidence isn't readily available, we're able to kind of extrapolate from what is known. And I have an example of that I can share with you. Let's see if I can bring this one up. Here's an example. Okay. I'll come back to that in a minute, but the thing that I wanted to share is here. The Homestead Parlors. For all the research and kind of forensic and physical evidence that we've gathered from other parts of the house, there's not that much for the Homestead Parlors. So here's an example where we have to look at the documentary record. Thomas Wentworth Higginson described the parlor on one of his visits as dark and cool and stiffish. That's pretty vague, but that's what we've got. Martha Dickinson Bianchi, Emily's niece, described the wallpaper as white with large figures. Well, that's just a little bit more specific. But the one that's most helpful is this carpet that was described by a guest as a fabulous Brussels woven in a pattern. It had in the center a great basket of flowers from which roses were spilling all over the floor to a border of more flowers at the edge. So Mary Lou Davis, our decorative consultant, went on an extremely thorough search for a carpet that was true to the period and that could speak to this description. And after some months of that investigation and research, we were kind of settling on something that, if you really stretched your imagination, you could almost see a basket in it, but not really. And then she made contact with a company that happened to have a point paper, which I'll explain in a moment, of a carpet first manufactured in the 1840s. So they still had the pattern for it that could be used on the looms to weave the carpet. But this is what it turns out to be. So the image here in the center is an image, a colored image of that point paper with the colorways to the left and to the right. But this is the closest we've come to something that corresponds to that description of a carpet woven in a pattern. And by pattern, it's sort of like strips with baskets of flowers. And so we consider that kind of a win. So those are some of the things. We also can borrow. The Evergreens was left pretty thoroughly furnished. We can borrow design ideas from the Evergreens or from other sites that may have decor from a similar period, from like a similar cultural environment, so maybe a rural site somewhere. But things that kind of make sense. And so another example is these two floor coverings. So we've been puzzled for quite a while over what to do about the floor covering in the main hall. In the 19th century, many were floor cloths rather than carpets. There wasn't anything like that left at the homestead, but at the Evergreens, we found two scraps of floor cloths. And this one with the hole in it, this one we found in an upstairs closet. And this hole is where some ductwork was slotted through the floor cloth, but it turns out to be very similar in pattern. Oh, and you can see it's quite soiled also, but turns out to be very similar in pattern to this example from, I think this may be from a Historic New England's collection. So there's this kind of borrowing that can go on also. And then sometimes there's this kind of serendipitous thing that happens when you stumble across something. So here's an example of an area that was encapsulated behind a ceiling that was lower than the original ceiling. So under that, we found three examples of wallpapers. And the one that we began to look at is this one. It seemed to be approximately the right, and this is from the Homestead. So this is an actual Homestead wallpaper. And it seemed to be from about the right period. The other two were too late for our purposes. And there's more to say about this, but we're going to reproduce this wallpaper, and you'll get more of the story about that in a subsequent program.
That's really awesome. And I guess sort of speaking of, those kinds of stories, I think one thing that I find really exciting about restoration, at least personally, is this idea of sort of what you were saying, those serendipitous moments of physical evidence, discovering physical evidence. So I guess kind of along those lines, do you have a favorite story of discovering new evidence during this restoration process? Or is there like one structural detail in particular or finish that you're particularly excited to see at the end of this?
Yeah, there is something that, for as long as I've been at the Emily Dickinson Museum, I did not realize that this object was available to us until, I don't know, sometime in just the last few years. And so I'm going to share my screen again and show you. Sorry to make you go through these again. This is the 19th century front door at the Homestead. And this door, along with a number of other architectural elements, such as original stair balusters and some other windows, was kind of hidden away up in the loft of the garage. And it was finally kind of realized that, oh yeah, this is the front door. And I want to sort of call your attention to this little area right here in the center of the door. I'm going to go back. And you can see, this is a 1916 photograph, and you can see this little shiny spot right there in the doorway. And that turns out to be the nameplate for the Dickinsons. So these are just a couple of other little details of the door with this really nice sort of Eastlake style lock plate, and some fragments of etched glass that we hope we'll be able to reproduce. But I think that's one of my favorites. Is when the Park family purchased this house, they didn't actually realize it was the home of one of the world's greatest poets, because she was not yet considered one of the world's greatest poets. But as they continued to, some of these early changes they made to the house, for some reason, they kept some of this original material and saved it, so that we now get to, bring it back into into its original configuration. So that's just really exciting.
Yeah, we're definitely lucky the Parks were keeping this material alive for us. I think everyone on this call was very grateful for their preservation work, whether they knew that they were doing it or not. And I think that kind of leads in to the next question about the people on this call and the people around the world who are excited to get back into the museum. And so we're curious how this restoration will improve the visitors' experiences when they visit the homestead in person.
Yeah, well, that that too is one of the really exciting elements of this restoration. So I'll just kind of quickly go through it. So hopefully we can get to some Q&A. And to me, some of this history of ownership and decorative changes to the house has kind of obscured the Dickinson era style and appearance. And so for some time, for perfectly fine reasons, the environment within the house has been kind of neutral, spare, and I can't help but think that kind of surround could have helped to sort of reinforce an idea of Emily Dickinson as only remote, cloistered, sort of a wisp in white. So I'm counting on this restoration to reassert kind of vibrant, real 19th century decor and the setting in which Emily Dickinson, the working poet, refined her art, her craft. So I'm hoping that it will help us to enhance an interpretation of Emily Dickinson as multi-dimensional, that we'll be able to talk more about the constraints and privileges and responsibilities and the choices that she made, to make that a fuller story while still, honoring all of her accomplishments and dimensions. And then I guess also an important part of this restoration is to bring a new space online, which is the room at the top of the stairs, which we're going to interpret as the room in which Emily Norcross Dickinson spent the last years of her life as an invalid. So that'll allow us to talk more about another aspect of the 19th century and of Dickinson family relationships, as the daughters became the caretakers of the mother, and about healthcare, death and dying, and to address a greater range of topics. And then certainly down in the parlors and the halls, that I think will better represent the Dickinson family status in the town and their position and their involvements, and be able to address more of those issues as well.
That all of those changes seem amazing. I think this is the point where we're going to go over to Q&A and allow some of the audience questions to come in as well.
Yes, so I want to share a question now from our audience, and I'm not surprised at all to see a question about a beloved space, a Dickinson's bedroom. So Deborah says, I'd love to hear more about Dickinson's bedroom, such as theories about wear patterns on her floor or more about the wallpaper. Also, will the discovered wallpaper fragments be exhibited?
Yeah, so the Dickinson bedroom restoration was just an awesome project. And it kind of got its start with the discovery of a fragment of wallpaper. Again, this is something that was encapsulated above the level of a ceiling, but was then able to be recovered along with several other fragments. So the process so the fragments altogether didn't create an entire full repeat, an entire full pattern. So again, research was applied to wallpapers of that style from the 19th century and what their structure would be like and what their colorways would be like. So we were able to recreate that pattern. It's one of these things that where there is some concrete evidence, but maybe not quite enough. So we think that it matches the fragments that we have. So we think it's a very very good version of the wallpaper in Dickinson's bedroom. One of the great documents that helped us in that restoration was a description of how the room was arranged. That was written by her niece Martha at the time. Well, it was kind of around the time that the house was being closed up. I think it must have been maybe just after Lavinia passed away, but she kind of went around the room and pointed out where, you know, she's got these books on the shelf. She's got these authors on the walls. She's got the dresser between the two windows on the south side, and she's got her writing stand under the west window. So all of those things are really extraordinarily useful, but also encouraging and heartening. You know, we've got something good to go on, and that we're doing the best job that we can. During that restoration, as in this one, we took up the floorboards that were installed in the 20th century to try to level out the floors. We took them up to reveal the original 19th century floorboards. And in Dickinson's room, to me, I think one of the most arresting events in that whole process was to see these two spots where the pigment on the original floorboard had been worn away, and one was directly in front of the location of the dresser, and the other was on the at her bedside, where, you know, someone getting out of bed in the morning, that's where their feet would hit the floor. So that was kind of affecting, I think, to me.
Muted. We have a question from Reba, and Reba wonders if there are any specific objects that you look forward to having on display once the rest.
And assigned, well, because all of the collections really ended up at the Evergreens. So we kind of had to sift through and figure out, well, what's appropriate to the Homestead and what's appropriate to the Evergreens. And so she has assigned objects to the Homestead that we are just thrilled to be able to bring back home and to have them assume, you know, rightful places in the spaces to which they belong. I think one of the things that interests me most about what we can do with this restoration is where we can is the artwork that we can bring back. So we have some family portraits, but we know that they also had engravings in the parlors, and for a while we have have left some of those parlor walls a little on the bare side. So I'm hoping that, you know, the combination of the wallpaper and returning more artwork to the parlors is something that I guess I'm looking forward to.
Thank you. So we have a question that we could answer in part or in whole. But Kristen has questions about if the barn and other outbuildings are gone, and if the museum has a future vision for reproducing these spaces. And then there's a second part about perhaps being able to demonstrate the practical aspects of what it took to maintain a household in Dickinson, like Dickinson's in the 19th century.
That's a terrific question about some things that are coming up for the Emily Dickinson Museum. And I think actually I'll answer the second part of the question first, because we think this is how this is going to unfold chronologically. So with this project, putting the main part of the original main part of the house back in order, that leaves only the east addition and the north addition to restore in a future phase. On the first floor, the east addition was the dining room. The north addition was the kitchen, laundry, woodroom, and privy. And to demonstrate, what it took in the 19th century to maintain a household, we're very excited about returning domestic service spaces, not only the spaces where the activities unfolded, but also above that, on the floor above that, spaces that may have been used by those who worked for the Dickinson family, so that we can tell more. We can talk more about issues of race and ethnicity and immigration and class, and along with the activities that both servants undertook for their employers, but those two that meant much to Emily Dickinson in her own daily life. So for the first part of the question, we do have a vision for returning those outbuildings to the landscape. And that is, it's the lifeways that the Dickinson family and their Amherst neighbors pursued. Involved, it was a rural community and an educational community, and the activities that were associated with a carriage house and a barn, we're eager to incorporate all of that as well. So we do have plans to reconstruct the carriage house that stood next to the Evergreens, and to reconstruct the barn that stood behind the homestead, and to use them so that they would be placed back on the original 3 acres that the Dickinsons owned on the north side of Main Street, and would help the museum to provide more great programming and services for its visitors.
Yeah, so, this has been such a great program, and we have an outpouring of wonderful questions. So I think we're going to take 2 more. We might go over just a few minutes, but we're so delighted with all of these questions. And I want to ask one from our Facebook that I think is really thoughtful and is at the heart of what we try to do here at the museum. This person asks, have Emily's letters and poems themselves been a source of what you use to consider restoration? Are there any descriptions in the poems or letters that discuss the rooms in a specific way?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We have probably combed through the letters, more than once, looking for those clues, and sometimes we can find them, and sometimes it takes another pass for something to click for us. But yeah, I can give you a couple of examples. And this is related again to the question about lack of concrete evidence and what clues we can glean. So the room at the top of the room on the second floor at the top of the stairs to the second floor. It's most likely that when Edward Dickinson purchased the house again and renovated it for his family, it was a large house. There were a number of rooms for all the family occupants. And sort of by process of elimination over the years, there have been some conclusions drawn about who was in what room. Emily's room is very definite. That was marked on that 1916 floor plan. There's a letter in which Emily describes her response or reaction to a fire in Amherst, and says something about seeing something between the shade and the window, and that's been one very tenuous clue for us as to the function of that room back behind Emily's room as a place for that her mother occupied in about the last 10 years of her life. So that's pretty tenuous, but that's the kind of thing we have to go on in some instances. Other letters refer to objects or family activities in particular spaces, such as Lavinia playing the piano, in a particular room, our mother lying on a lounge in a particular space. So there are clues here and there about objects. There's a whole period of time when Emily was a young woman in which she was writing to her brother Austin, who was in Boston, Cambridge, asking him to make purchases for them. So it might be a whatnot, it might be some fabric, some ribbon, some music. So those kinds of things are mentioned from time to time.
Thank you. I love all those details. So a final question. Anne wants to know when the restoration will begin. So maybe the more of the physical work being done, and does the museum have any plans to allow the public to observe the restoration process? So as you answer that, Jane, you might tell us all the ways that we can stay up to date as a community and support the museum.
So the actual work of restoration begins this month with the first thing to do is to dismantle some of the more modern elements that are most obvious in the house. You never know with a restoration when you start to take things apart whether you'll discover something new that you didn't know about. So that begins this month. We have a kind of a fast timeline for this. So we are hoping that that we can first complete the most of the major construction pieces of the restoration by early 2022, and that some more of the finishes, the soft goods, the floor coverings, and the furnishings can be installed late winter and spring, so that we can open again. Hopefully, you never know. I always hate to give a date because I'll always disappoint people, but we're hoping late spring 2022. Yeah, thank you. And if you're near some wood, please knock on the wood. So how to keep up? Well, we have 2 more programs in this restoration series, and one will focus more on architectural research and findings, and how restoration plans are actually, they actually make it from research into drawn plans. And then one about the decorative aspects of the restoration, and that that ranges across a number of topics and a number of kind of separate research strands. So those will be coming to you in August and September. And then you can always keep up with what we're doing in our electronic newsletter, Message from the Meadows, and updates on our website. And so we hope that you'll get ready for what we think is going to be a really breathtaking reopening in spring 2022. And in the meantime, to support this restoration, if you can, please make a gift to the Emily Dickinson Fund. That goes a long way towards supporting these efforts and to making it possible for us to carry on both restoration and continue virtual programming at the same time. So I hope that you'll continue to join us as we move through this over the next some months.
Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We have a link now in the chat if you do feel able to donate, and we appreciate all of your time and all these wonderful questions. I hope you'll join us, questions in hand, for our next program in August. Have a great evening and take care.